Welcome, everybody, and good morning. For those of you I have not yet had the opportunity to meet, I am Ian Solomon, Dean of the University of Virginia Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. Welcome to our great hall, and look around, it is a truly great hall here on UVA grounds at the Batten School. We are very pleased to welcome you for an important and probably sobering but informative discussion about Russia's attack on Ukraine, with a focus on the policy, diplomacy, and humanitarian implications. I am filling in as moderator, as a substitute for Batten's very special Professor Phil Potter. So if you're expecting Phil, you're stuck with me. Phil was called away, but I'm really quite pleased to be able to join this discussion and to welcome you all here. Indeed, it really is a privilege to moderate this conversation between three experts at the University of Virginia: Ambassador Stephen Mull, the Honorable George Forsman, Professor Kirsten Gelsdorf. And I will introduce each of them before they will say a few remarks, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience and hopefully an active conversation among all of us who are assembled here today. Before I do the introductions, though, I just want to say a few words to set the stage, since we're all probably watching different things, perhaps, and hearing different news. I know many of us have been watching the situation in Ukraine unfold since before the beginning of the year. U.S. intelligence officials had been closely tracking the buildup of Russia's troops near the Ukraine-Russia border. Last fall, we started to hear this in the news a bit more. In November, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said, "We're not sure exactly what Mr. Putin is up to, but these movements certainly have our attention." In December, President Biden warned Putin not to invade Ukraine. In January, the State Department ordered the families of U.S. embassy staff to leave Ukraine, and NATO placed its forces on standby. In February, the Russian troop buildup along the border with Ukraine continued. Estimates then were about 150 to 190,000 troops. And then February 24th, just last Thursday, Russian forces attacked Ukrainian territory. Now, I trust we've all seen over the past week the images of missiles raining down on Ukraine cities, the convoys of Russian troops and equipment. We've seen the images of people fleeing their homes, fleeing the cities, huddling underground in train stations. We've all gotten to know the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, and his appeals to the Ukrainian people, the Russian people, people of the West for support. We've also witnessed the 27 member states of the European Union work more swiftly and more collaboratively than perhaps we ever have before, enacting swift and severe sanctions against Russian financial institutions and individuals, and sending military equipment. Now, the Russian attack in the first few days appeared to be less successful than expected, but the tactics seem to have shifted in recent days with many more civilian casualties. People sometimes ask me, and probably all of us, why the US and the EU have not intervened more directly, what our options are. What can we expect from this crisis? How will it unfold? What is at stake? And what are the implications? Well, that's some of what we're going to be discussing today on this panel. And I'm really pleased to invite our first person to address us, Ambassador Stephen Mull, the University of Virginia's Vice Provost for Global Affairs. Ambassador Mull has served in a broad range of U.S. national security positions, most recently as the Acting Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the State Department. He also served as lead coordinator for the Iran nuclear implementation from August 2015 through 2017. Ambassador Mull was the U.S. ambassador to Poland from 2012 to 2015, and ambassador to Lithuania in 2003 to 2006. Ambassador Mull is the recipient of many distinguished service awards for the State Department, 2 Presidential Meritorious Service Awards, 2 Distinguished Honor Awards, the Baker-Wilkins Award for Outstanding Deputy Chief of Mission, 2 Superior Honor Awards. I could go on, more than a dozen Senior Foreign Service Performance Awards. Perhaps the highest honor was him joining this team here at UVA in 2018, and we were extremely fortunate to have him here. So Steve, can I invite you to say about 5 minutes of remarks?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dean Solomon, and thanks to all of you for coming out and caring about this issue. You know, there have been few military conflicts in history that have had as much advance warning as this one has had, but that doesn't make the horror of what you've just described a few moments ago any less than what we're seeing, and it only seems to be getting worse every day with Ukraine's nuclear industry now falling into the crosshairs. Ukraine, for centuries, has been at the crossroads of European security conflict. So in some senses, what we're seeing today is a continuation of something that's gone on for centuries. Ukraine did not exist as an independent state ever until 1991, when, as the Soviet Union fell apart, it voted in a referendum to declare independence, and more than 92% of the people of Ukraine voted for independence. That ushered in a period of great instability, domestic political instability within Ukraine, with a tug of war between people who wanted to be more affiliated with the West, the European Union, and NATO, and those who preferred to have a more productive relationship with the newly democratizing Russia. There was a series of presidents that went back and forth. Whoever was president had to grapple with a very corrupt economic system, a very immature political system, not very much of civil society. That's begun to change over the past 30 years, but it was tough going at the beginning. One of the interesting details left from the Cold War is that there were a number of nuclear weapons left on Ukrainian territory. That was a great concern for Western governments. And in 1994, President Clinton joined Prime Minister John Major and Boris Yeltsin with the then president of Ukraine to sign something called the Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine agreed to give up all of the nuclear weapons on its territory, return them to Russian control, in exchange for commitment of each of those parties to respect Ukraine's borders and sovereignty going forward. Fast forward about 10 years later, there was something known as the Orange Revolution, in which a candidate who wanted to bring Ukraine more dramatically to the West, Viktor Yushchenko, ran against Viktor Yanukovych. Yushchenko was mysteriously, some say not so mysteriously, poisoned and almost assassinated, and in the end was declared the loser of the election that was just really rife with a lot of fraud. The Ukrainian Supreme Court ordered a rerun, and Yushchenko was elected despite having almost died and became president in 2005, and he started taking Ukraine on a much more Western march. That paid off in 2008 when he managed to convince the Bush administration to come out strongly in favor of bringing Ukraine into NATO, which set alarm bells all off through Moscow and among Moscow's allies. And also set off alarm bells among many of our other allies, the French and Germans, who feared that bringing Ukraine into NATO would be too provocative to Russia. So the Bush administration pushed back very hard, and in the end came out with a halfway measure saying someday, Ukraine and Georgia will be in NATO. But there was no prediction of when that would happen. And even today, almost 15 years later, even before the war, there's no immediate prospect of Ukraine becoming part of NATO. In 2010, Yanukovych ran for president again, generally considered to be pro-Moscow. He won the election that time and very quickly encountered rising sentiment in Ukraine for Ukraine to develop a closer relationship with the European Union. And he began a process of negotiations to bring Ukraine closer to the European Union. That came very close to being signed in 2014. And the Russian government got very nervous about the prospect of Ukraine linking more closely to the West. And they basically ordered President Yanukovych to not sign that agreement, which caused a huge popular uprising in Ukraine, which later became known as the Revolution of Dignity. And it ended up driving Yanukovych from power in 2015. Series of presidential elections after that, but most importantly, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 to push back against that. Basically took two provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk, under its immediate control, working with separatists in those two provinces in the east, and slicing off the Crimean Peninsula, which had been Ukrainian property since 1954, when the Soviet Union had given it to Ukraine. And they've remained in control of Crimea ever since then. In fact, it was an important launching off point for the invasion now. President Zelensky led, and his predecessor, President Poroshenko, were very alarmed by this. It deepened in them a conviction that Ukraine had to be in NATO. And they even wrote it into their constitution that it is Ukraine's national interest to be in NATO to protect Ukraine from further Russian aggression. That got the Russians much more nervous about that. Fast forward today, why did Russia invade now? The strange thing about this conflict is that there was no single spark to set it off. There was no moment like at the beginning of World War I with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that kicked off World War I. Instead, I think Putin calculated that it was an optimal time from a geopolitical point of view to launch the war. Certainly, Ukraine, as I mentioned, was nowhere near joining NATO and probably wouldn't have been for at least 10 more years. There are NATO troops in the eastern border of NATO in Poland and the Baltic states, but they've only been there in response to the Russian invasion in 2014. I think Putin saw that there was a mood of retrenchment in the United States, the exit from Afghanistan, the disinclination to get involved in more overseas wars, growing European energy dependency on Russia, massive political polarization in the West and division, fault lines in the transatlantic relationship that had gotten worse during the Trump administration, COVID-related distress, distraction, the economics of it all, a new government in Germany of social democrats, which historically have had friendlier relations with Russia. And on the Russian side, they have succeeded in much more co-opting Belarus into the Russian camp, which certainly remains true today. In fact, Belarus was the staging point for most of the invasion that just happened. And Russia's military is also a lot stronger than it had been any other time in the last 30 years. It's particularly developed its skills in urban warfare, perfecting them using some pretty brutal tactics in Syria and the Syrian civil war over the past few years. So I think Putin decided this was the right time to move to decapitate the Zelensky government, to stop Ukraine's drift into the West. But instead of citing any of these reasons, he instead rationalized the invasion on as a former diplomat, I shouldn't say this, but let's be honest, a pack of lies that Ukraine is governed by Nazis, even though President Zelensky is Jewish, that Ukraine is building nuclear weapons, a ridiculous assertion, that Ukraine is committing genocide, that Ukraine was about to join NATO and use it as a staging ground for attacking Russia. I think Putin miscalculated. In fact, as you mentioned, Dean Solomon, the West rapidly came together with some punishing sanctions that are having quite a dramatic and disastrous impact on the Russian economy. The Ukrainian resistance is much greater than what I think that Putin and the Russian military expected. And the Ukrainian skill in mastering the information space, the information war, has been really quite impressive. How does it all end? It's too soon to tell. There's no question that the Russian military is substantially stronger than the Ukrainian military. And most people would bet that the Russians are going to succeed in deposing the Zelensky government and imposing some kind of military control on Ukraine, which will likely result in a bloody insurgency, probably with U.S. and other Western support for years to come, that will turn Ukraine into a pretty nasty battlefield as the insurgency unfolds. There could be a diplomatic solution. Yesterday it was kind of interesting. And Kirsten, you may have more to say about this. There was an agreement for temporary ceasefires to allow humanitarian corridors, provision of humanitarian supplies into certain areas. That raises hope. Anytime the fighting stops, that's obviously a good thing, but we can't really trust that Putin will stick to that. What was also quite interesting was yesterday Putin decided to call Macron. Putin's calling Macron, the French president. Why would he do that? Macron said the call went very badly, but I think it indicates that Putin is a little bit alarmed by what the impact of Western unity in response, and could be starting to look for an off-ramp. So in the West, we have to be alert to those possibilities and pursue them where we can. And finally, there's the possibility of rebellion against Putin within Russia. I think that's probably unlikely, but the scope of domestic protests against the war within Russia is much greater than anybody anticipated. And I know our hearts are with the people who are pushing within Russia for an end to the war. So I'll stop there. I'll look forward to taking any questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mull. And we will have time for questions, so if you think of some, write them down, remember them. We'll have after we hear from our speakers. But now I'd like to welcome George Forsman, Executive Director and Senior Advisor of the Batten School National Security Policy Center. Mr. Forsman, the Honorable Mr. Forsman, is confirmed by the U.S. Senate, is a sought-after expert on national security matters. He served as Virginia's Homeland Security Secretary and also at the federal level as Undersecretary of Preparedness in the Department of Homeland Security. He's led more than 25 national working groups and co-chaired a 5-year congressionally established commission on U.S. security, and has helped to guide the training and development of over 2,500 civilian and military senior executives across several hundred organizations. Welcome, Mr. Forsman.
Thanks, Dean, and thank all of you all for being here today. And Steve, thanks for that, because I think the foundation that Ambassador Mull has set for you helps us to understand and to contextualize what's going on and why it's going on. What I thought I'd do is maybe take my 5 minutes and preface a couple of thought-provoking questions from a national security policy standpoint. And the one that seems to be permeating among a lot of folks is, was this a surprise to the U.S. national security establishment? And as Ambassador Mull said, no, we've been expecting this. And we've seen a series of activities over the course of the previous 2 or 3 administrations that have been preparing for this eventuality. Certainly the current administration has dealt with it in the most recent time. President Trump's administration, President Obama's administration, and President Bush's administration have had to deal with component pieces of the Ukrainian situation over the course of the past 20 years. And for that very reason, we've seen a great deal of preparedness activities that have gone on across the Department of Defense, across the State Department, across our international coalition of partners to prepare for this eventuality. And as Ambassador Mull pointed out, there's been a unity among European nations, frankly, unity among the world in terms of how to respond to this. And I think it is indicative of the fact that we knew it was going to happen, we expected it was going to happen, and there's no real surprise here. The one minor surprise may be the level of fidelity that the nations seem to have, including Ukraine, in terms of what Russia's plan was, in terms of a false flag operation, where they were likely to place military assets, how they were likely to enter the country. Maybe the one surprise in that is the ferocity, the vindictiveness that we've seen on the part of the Russian military in terms of indiscriminate bombing of civilians and just the horror of war. War is ugly anytime, but it seems to be more ugly because it's in our living room through social media, through the network coverage, and a variety of other things. But I think there have been a series of other events that all of us as Americans need to be sensitive to because we knew Russia was headed down this road. We've seen a level of cyber activity over the precursing 5-year period, not only directed at Ukraine, but directed at countries that might come to Ukraine's aid. Whether we're talking about European countries, all of us remember the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, which has been loosely tracked back to Russia. All of those are indicative that Russia was sending a message to the rest of the world. If we choose to do something, don't interfere because we can interfere with your lives. But unfortunately, or fortunately, we just don't know at this point, did President Putin calculate or miscalculate in terms of what the world would do in response to an invasion in Ukraine? The second question is, are there some lessons that the U.S. national security establishment is going to learn out of what's going on? There'll be plenty of lessons, but I think first and foremost is the whole issue of nuclear proliferation, counter-proliferation, non-proliferation is going to come back to the forefront of the public discourse, certainly across the national security establishment. I can only imagine that when we get into an Iran nuclear talks, they're going to say, look what happened to Ukraine when they gave up their nuclear weapons. We need to have nuclear weapons to be able to ensure our sovereignty and our integrity and to be the ultimate fail-safe. So I think for a generation of current national security professionals, but certainly, Ian, for a future generation, getting back into understanding the absolute horror of nuclear weapons, but we can't put the genie back in the bottle. So how do we take that absolute horror and contain it in some form or fashion? Ambassador Mull highlighted, where does this go from here? And the short answer is we don't know. We can expect that given Russia's ability to mass military might in the way that they are able to mass it, given the fact that they have effectively minimized the potential for external involvement to support Ukraine, one can reasonably suspect that they are going to succeed at their military objectives. But as Ambassador Mull pointed out, they may face a very sinister insurgency, which is going to result in a series of national security challenges, not only for the U.S., but certainly for the NATO states, the European states. And I frankly think we're entering a period of global instability, if one might say that we've been in a period of global stability for the past 2 decades. The question that's in the back of the mind of every one of my relatives who's called me on the phone in the past 5 days, and students that we've talked to is, are we on the precipice of a nuclear conflict? And I think the short answer is no. But I think for a generation of folks who did not grow up during the Cold War, you're seeing the absolute chess game that is played with nuclear weapons as the ultimate fail-safe for nation states. It underscores the importance of understanding who's got nuclear weapons, who the leaders are of those countries that have nuclear weapons, what are the fail-safes, what are the cooperatives for global peace that we're putting in place. But the bottom line is we are, in many ways, going through the same thing that previous generations went through during the Cold War in terms of talking about security challenges with the ultimate backdrop of nuclear weapons. But I say this as someone who has dealt with America's nuclear weapons enterprise. The level of dialogue in the last 7 days, though disconcerting, has been exceptionally responsible on the part of Russia, more than exceptionally responsible on the part of the U.S., its allies, European nations. And so what I say to the vast majority of folks that are unnerved is this is the normal chess game that you see with nuclear weapons. And then finally, the one that I think is always important is, what does this mean to you and me? You know, there's a great deal of fear and trepidation as a result of everyone waking up this morning and seeing on the news that a nuclear power plant in Ukraine had been attacked and it was on fire. There's a lot of trepidation about what is this going to mean in terms of 30 million Ukrainian citizens, their freedoms, their liberties, their rights. What is this going to mean, as Kirsten will talk about here in a few minutes, in terms of mass migration and what effect that has on global security, both now but also in the future. But the one thing I would say, and I say this as having spent 35 years in this crisis management business, I lived through things like the sniper in Virginia, 9/11, a variety of other events, is the first news is usually wrong. And it's going to take us a period of time to gain a clear understanding of what's going on the ground. This is a hybrid conflict, and the information domain has never been as important as it is in this conflict. Russia is effectively using it to control its citizens. Ukraine is effectively using it to influence the world. That's not right, it's not wrong, it is what it is. But we have to understand the dimension of the information domain. And you know, when I raised early in my specter, has President Putin calculated or miscalculated? There's a generational component to this. A younger generation understands the information domain in a way that my generation may not, and maybe President Putin's generation does not. And I think it's going to be an influence on us as we go forward. But for you and me, the best antidote to fear and trepidation is knowledge. That's why I'm glad to see so many people sitting in this room today. I'm glad that we have people online. We don't know all of the facts. We're not going to know all of the facts over the coming days, weeks, and months. But the more informed we are, the more resilient we are. And the more resilient we are, the better prepared we are. So, Dean Solomon, I appreciate you taking the initiative to put this together. And I appreciate the fact that so many people on a beautiful Friday in Charlottesville, Virginia, and wherever our online audience is, took time to join us.
Thank you so much for that. Very, very helpful. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Kirsten Gelsdorf, Professor of Practice of Public Policy and Leadership here at the Batten School and Director of Global Humanitarian Policy. At Batten, Professor Gelsdorf co-directs the UVA Humanitarian Collaborative. In addition to being an extraordinary teacher, she has led numerous research projects for organizations such as the American Red Cross, United Nations, Sesame Workshop, the German government. She's also been elected to serve on the World Economic Forum Advisory Network as a senior fellow at the United Nations Center for Humanitarian Data. Previously, she was Chief of Policy Analysis and Innovation at the UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. She also served as Humanitarian Advisor to President Bill Clinton in his role as Special Envoy to Haiti, and as a Policy Advisor to UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon on the global food crisis. Thank you, Kirsten.
Thanks. So maybe I think I'll start by saying, you know, I think when you think about the humanitarian situation, many of you are probably seeing images of like women and children at the border or people huddled. It's really hard to see all of those things. And, you know, I think it brings both despair and confusion and uncertainty. And, you know, even after my long career of working in humanitarian aid, those are still emotions that I feel. So that's kind of, you know, that kind of comes with it. But I think what's important to think about is how you hold two feelings in your mind at the same time, right? These ones of confronting despair and overwhelm, and also kind of seeing progress and change and action. So I thought that I would kind of frame my opening remarks to kind of give you a little bit about both of those. And what I want to do is kind of just first give you just a little snapshot of what we're seeing is the humanitarian situation, and then maybe give you some behind the headlines analysis from the different operational calls that I've been involved in the last couple of days on both these things, the challenges and what we can maybe find some hope in. So in terms of the situation, I think many of you are aware, it's kind of the humanitarian crisis is unfolding on two fronts, right? What's happening inside Ukraine and what's happening cross-border. And inside Ukraine, of course, there's the casualties that we're still trying to get a handle on. But there's also, you know, these what we call kind of a wave of secondary morbidity and mortality that were expected. So things like medical care, not only for people who are impacted by the crisis, but also, you know, cancer treatments or COVID or all of these other things, right? The system's kind of shut down. And all of a sudden you have a lot of kind of these secondary crises that are real needs for people. There's also electricity, heat, a disruption in water and sanitation, supply chains for food. You know, so you're, as a humanitarian system in Ukraine right now, they're trying to look at all of those basic social services. And at the same time, there's displacement happening inside the country. So we have around between 200,000 and 300,000 people internally displaced, meaning mostly leaving cities and going to rural areas. But the prediction is that that could go up to like a number like 6 million. And so while right now it's kind of promising that people are staying in these rural areas, if 6 million, how will that overwhelm these rural areas that maybe aren't hit by shelling, but all of a sudden have also massive, massive needs on their infrastructure in the same way. There's smaller things too, like banking infrastructure being impacted and what needs are out from that. And then, of course, most importantly, people wanting to leave Ukraine and having challenges with that. So that's kind of what the system is trying to look at. Cross-border, I think many of you are probably much more familiar. The number is over 1 million now, people who kind of cross the border, most into Poland, long lines to get across, all of those things that you're seeing, family tracing. And so the international system is really kind of working to work on those border areas and try to help with kind of outflows and assistance for all of the prima facie refugees that are kind of are crossing over. So behind those headlines, right, I thought since we're a public policy and leadership school, I kind of wanted to emphasize that in humanitarian aid, a lot of people think of assistance as like, okay, we're just going to help, right? But it's not really about helping in these instances. It's about good policy and good leadership, because aid can also do a lot of harm if it's not thought through carefully, which is why I'm so excited we teach this here in a public policy school. The challenge is the data needed to make these good policy decisions is really hard to come by, right? The biggest challenge right now is access within the country. So getting the information, getting access to people who are in need, security constraints, all of those things. Even if you had clear informational pictures about what was happening inside, things change so rapidly in these crises. People are moving all the time. So even if you say, oh, there are 200,000 people here, we need this much assistance, 6 hours later, that could look very different. So you're in this constant process of contingency planning and assistance happening all the time. And that makes it really hard to think about how are you using numbers, how are you using experiences from past support in Ukraine to kind of make decisions. One of the main things is also to think about where the international system provides aid will also impact what the humanitarian situation looks like, right? So for example, if a lot of aid were to be presented on one border, that would probably be a draw for many people who were going to that area. If that government then decided not to have this opening of a policy to refugees, you would have been putting a lot of people in a dangerous situation. So every decision on where you want to help or provide aid requires really quick and thoughtful analysis about what it will do to choices that people are making in these really extreme circumstances. Same thing in terms of kind of who you're working with. So you want to make sure the international system isn't somehow putting away the capacity or hindering the capacity of the local government or local authorities or local organizations, but you also want to be thinking about who you're legitimizing by who you're working with in these instances, especially in a conflict type situation. And the main reason I think that what a lot of humanitarian organizations are now kind of talking about behind the scenes is the challenge that within humanitarian aid, we function under a premise of wanting to be neutral and impartial, right? Not take sides in a conflict. So while in this instance, it seems like all of the media attention is like Russia is the aggressor, as a humanitarian system, you want to be very careful with that language, because if Russia ends up taking control of many areas in Ukraine, and I think we predict that, well, then Russia would maybe cut off access to different humanitarian operators if they have been speaking out against Russia, right? Versus the neutrality of being able to provide aid. And so as a humanitarian system, trying to maintain access and information is one of the key things. And I think this is what's getting really blurred in this crisis, where you're seeing a lot of humanitarian organizations, my personal opinion, of using the Ukraine flag, and how is that going to kind of play out? Because I think, as we've heard, we need to play the long game with assistance, and that means really careful thought in both ethics, policies, numbers, all of those things. That goes beyond just Russia cutting off access, right? It's like data. How are we collecting data on people, and could Russia target different individuals in different ways? So kind of trying to think about data security and privacy. There's a few other kind of knock-on effects. The unprecedented sanctions, it's unclear what's going to happen with the most vulnerable populations in Russia itself as well. And the humanitarian system needs to think about what are obligations to assist the most vulnerable people in Russia. Global food security, right? Russia, Ukraine, massive wheat producers, the World Food Program, which is the world's food provider, 40% of their wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine, right? So all of a sudden, There's a massive food insecurity in addition to the highest food prices we've seen in a decade. So how will that impact Yemen, Somalia, Sudan? We have Ethiopia. We have massive food security issues happening. And I think many of you have seen the news coverage on kind of racism that we're seeing get an inequity at the borders, right, with Ukrainians, mostly African, Middle Eastern individuals also trying to get out of Ukraine, not being able to cross the border, or just kind of I think the humanitarian system is also talking about, again, it's so exciting, right? $1.5 billion was raised in a day. That's unprecedented for humanitarian assistance. So there's celebration, but the underlying, I think, feeling for some is, wait, the world could kick in $1.5 billion in a day, and yet we have these massive struggles in these other places, like, all these other contexts right now. There's, 287 million people around the world getting humanitarian aid. So when we're looking at the 6 million in Ukraine, it's just one piece of a bigger pie. Okay, positives I want to end with. I think, and this could be up for debate, that the humanitarian system is built for this crisis, right? Most of the humanitarian infrastructure came out of World War II for exactly a conflict like this, right? 2 states, refugee flows in Europe. That's how the whole shebang was organized. So in some ways, I think the humanitarian system is feeling really confident that we know what we're doing. COVID, super hard. Insurgents, super hard. Non-state actors, places we don't have access. This is kind of what the system was built for. I do think there's change in the air, and so that might then get more complicated, right, if Russia starts to take over parts of Ukraine. But as of right now, the humanitarian system is well placed. Same goes as Ambassador Mull was talking about. We've been operating in Ukraine for 8 years. So there's a lot of coordination. 3 million people have been assisted. There's a lot of good organizations that have already set up humanitarian infrastructure. And then, of course, the aid that's happening is quite, I would say, if I was going to evaluate it, it's quite forward-thinking, right? So with $1.3 billion, you can do a lot, and I think that's going to create some problems as well. Having too much money too soon in a crisis is really complicated. But right now, what we're seeing with aid that's exciting is it's not just food and tents, it's a lot of cash transfers. And cash transfers being thought about not only where there's banking and where there isn't banking, knowing how many women and children, it's sexual and gender-based violence programming from the start, it's education from the start, right? It's all of these ways, it's good data privacy and security. It's fighting the infodemic, as we heard during COVID, right? Information is so key in these crises, and we learned in the Mediterranean refugee crisis. If people think one border is open and then it's closed, you've really hindered their coping strategy. So how do we keep a handle on information in this crisis? And then, of course, the open policies. I mean, Poland has not, and Ambassador Mull can talk more about this, been very open to refugees, right? I think it was Fortress Europe is what they used. And, the fact that the EU is talking about 3-year asylum policies, right, or temporary protection status. Kids are already allowed to go to school in Poland. People are talking about getting people to be able to work. These are huge advances in refugee policy that we do not see in many places. So in some ways, the architecture is being set up for a longer term response, not just this bed for the night emergency response. And then finally, you all are here. We've all said it, on the Friday afternoon before spring break. But I am, when you see people's Facebook and how many people care about this, it's kind of unbelievable, especially after the past few years, if talking about, Ethiopia or Yemen, and there's, very little. So this is really exciting, I think, in that side. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. I think many very rich insights, but I bet we also have some more questions from this group. Looks like Grace and Rachel can bring a microphone. If you'd like to raise a question, please raise your hand. I'm going to call on Ethan first in the front row here. I also see you, Tamsin, and see you, Maddie.
Is this thing working? Yeah. Is it working? Cool. Yeah, so my question basically, this is the School of Leadership and Public Policy. And I'm wondering what exactly can we as students take away from the example of President Zelensky's leadership in the past week, but maybe even going back further than that?
Thoughts on President Zelensky?
Well, I think it's a textbook case. He's, of course, comes from the entertainment world, and so he's quite gifted at messaging things in ways that people can understand, both through his words and his actions. His response to the news reports that the West was willing to help him get out of Ukraine, he responded, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition," is the sort of great phrase that just immediately captures the nature of the man, the nature of the Ukrainian people, and how they're facing this battle, and I'm sure was incredibly inspirational. So making sure that in a crisis, you are able to come up with crisp messaging points that people can remember and repeat, and inspires people to show the discipline. Next, if you're a leader, you're not going to be able to lead unless you're being seen with the people you're leading. And his remarkable ability to be on social media, to be out on the streets, even though he's a target for assassination, showing great personal bravery and fortitude and integrity and a sense of responsibility to his followers, I think have won him a very special place in the hearts of not only Ukrainians, but of the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think I just echo what Ambassador Mull has said. Leadership matters, and particularly in a crisis. And the ability to communicate is the most effective skill that you need out of a leader, and to impress the populace with the level of optimism and camaraderie that he has is a very special skill. But I think it also points to the fact that with the proliferation and the contested, congested nature of the information domain, President Zelensky is finding both mediums and mechanisms and messages that are resonating not only inside of Ukraine, but across the globe. And to some degree, like-minded nations leaders of like-minded nations can get together and say, if Russia does this, we're going to take aggressive action. President Zelensky gave them additional armor, if you will, to be very aggressive. And I think we're seeing a true profile in courage.
So I also am a fan, but I think maybe in the interest of interesting discussion, maybe I'll give a couple other slants of what I hope also President Zelensky does or has, which is, I hope he has the people around him as a leader so that he can, but to kind of give him the 360 view of all of the immediate decisions that he makes and what are the longer term consequences. So one that I know from my area is, there's a lot of talk about kind of mobilizing citizens, come and get your weapon. And while it's understandable, given the situation, from a humanitarian perspective, it's really complicated because you're mixing civilians and combatants. So under international humanitarian law, how can we provide aid? Then it gets really complicated very quickly about how you assist people without kind of being part of that infrastructure. How are you putting people? So it's this calculation. So I guess as a leadership public policy, I would also always say, you want to hear the alternate perspective. Similarly, I would say, given we knew the long lead up, I have questions on like contingency planning or information with different citizens about, displacement options and choices. And it seems like a lot of Ukrainians were really caught off guard. And so I would have questions about things like that as a leader, right? How do you instill support without instilling panic and things like that? So maybe those are some other thoughts.
If I could add one more thing,
Yeah.
You reminded me, there are also lessons coming from this crisis on how not to be a leader. And your mention of having 360 degrees of input and having advisors who disagree with you and tell you the truth. If you look at Vladimir Putin sitting at the end of that incredibly long conference table with all of his advisors and military leaders, 50 feet away, cowering, and his humiliation of some of his leading national security officials on national TV, it's not a good way to establish yourself as a leader, and I think is reflective of the very strange situation that's at play in Moscow right now.
First of all, thank you all for being here. Ambassador Mull, you mentioned earlier the assassination attempts and plots against President Zelensky. So kind of going off the previous question, I was interested in what you all thought, how critical his continued leadership and visibility is to the Ukrainian resistance, especially considering the role of the broader Ukrainian public and some recent shifts we've seen in President Zelensky's approach to things like interacting with the press, given those assassination attempts.
I would say it's absolutely essential. I mean, building off of Ethan's question, showing that you're there, you're in the trenches, you're with the people, you become a symbol for everyone. It becomes increasingly risky to be seen, and so I know he's getting a lot of professional advice on how to protect himself and how to hide and stay several feet ahead of the people who are trying to kill him and his family. But it's his number one priority is to be visible if he wants to inspire commitment and discipline and the will to fight.
Ian, let me add to that, though. I think, to the point, though, the Ukrainian government writ large has been very consistently on message. And what you hear from President Zelensky, what you hear from his defense minister, what you hear from members of parliament has been very consistent. And, to the degree that the assassination attempts were as large as they were, or were they smaller, were they as serious as we believe they are, less serious, it doesn't matter. I do believe that President Zelensky has created an idea. And the power of an idea for a populace, if he is unfortunately killed during this, I think he has already introduced a spark. And my best example is the Arab Spring. Who would have thought that we would have seen a complete rewrite of the Middle East as a result of something that happened in a square? And so I think that to some degree, he has already ignited the spark. And I think Russia militarily is going to be very successful in terms of the short term, but I think he's introduced a spark of insurgency that may rival what Russia faced in Afghanistan.
Tamsin, wait for the mic.
Hello. Given that Russia is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, what does its invasion of Ukraine say about the authority and legitimacy of the United Nations Security Council?
It severely compromises it, no question about that. The U.S. and its allies moved swiftly. Nobody was surprised that Russia vetoed any action within the Security Council. There's a not so well-known provision, Kirsten, maybe you can talk a little bit about it, within the UN Charter called Uniting for Peace, in which if the Security Council is unable to deal with an international security crisis, it gets kicked to the General Assembly where there is no veto and majority wins. And so that was voted to condemn the Russian invasion and call for an immediate ceasefire. And a resolution that Ukraine introduced, it got 141 out of 192 votes, which is a pretty phenomenal lopsided victory. But it raises a lot of question that the Security Council is not doing much to protect the security of the world because of the composition of it and the veto.
I mean, I think there's so many data points as to where the inefficiencies of the Security Council, right, from the Iraq invasion until, there are kind of countless incidences where I think reform of the Security Council is highly necessary. I think within the UN system, it doesn't, it's kind of like maybe the way people see UVA from outside. The humanitarian system, from the peacekeeping system, from the development, from the Security Council, they're really different bodies that operate independently. They all have certain kind of member state or government responsibilities that they work within. So they try to work within, the global system. But I do think that there are parts of the UN that are functioning well and parts that I think need a rethink. So even though I said, the systems are set up for this, some of those systems also massively need reform.
Questions? I see the second row there. The gray sweatshirt first.
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of coverage about sort of the strategic importance of Belarus, and it kind of brought me back to when Lukashenko was fraudulently elected, and we saw a lot of sort of massive protests, but they were met basically with not much support from the West, and then cracked down on by kind of Russian-backed militias. And I just I wonder, in light of sort of apathetic responses to more minor Russian aggression towards state sovereignty, how you would assess the Western and American deterrence efforts, and whether you think there's anything we could have done better, or the extent of Russian interests in Ukraine kind of made this inevitable.
That's a great question, and there are a couple of pieces to it, but I think Russia has been very effective at what I will call eating the pie one bite at a time, and the analogy of the boiling frog. And to some degree, none of the events that have occurred to the invasion point rose to the level of broad condemnation, international sanctions, and a variety of other things. Having said that, I think that they've written a chapter which policymakers, not only inside the U.S., but with an international coalition of partners, and some of the dialogue that has gone on between the militaries, the so-called Five Eye partners, but also a broader coalition of partners inside of NATO at a military level, has been very much focused on what is the pattern. And this actually goes to one of the things that Kirsten mentioned. What's the pattern? What's the data tell us? And I don't think that we live in an environment where countries like Russia, autocrats like Vladimir Putin, can live out in obscurity and outside the view. And so I think we're going to be able to track these things. And again, to some degree, could we have done things better? You can always do things better. Hindsight is in fact 2020. But I don't know that had we done anything better, that it would have stopped President Putin from making the decision to invade Ukraine. And the fact that they have nuclear weapons makes it difficult. Ultimately, Vladimir Putin is a big bully, but he happens to have nuclear weapons. So you're limited in terms of what you can do to that big bully.
I would add, anytime Russia commits aggression against one of its neighbors or props up an authoritarian, there's always a really wide-ranging debate within the U.S. government and among our allies about what's the right response. And it's driven by two fundamentally, philosophically different views of the world. One is the so-called foreign policy realist, not to get into too much theory, who thinks that power matters and big powers get special rights and privileges, and they get spheres of influence. And then there's the more liberal approach to international relations that prizes democratic processes, building the network of world democracies. And when something happens, when there's a crackdown in Belarus, the realists say, well, they're Russia's neighbor. Why we don't want to go to war for Belarus? Just as they're saying now, we don't want to go to war for Ukraine. And that kind of debate, every time issues like this come up, in fact, makes the response a compromise or something in the middle that often is not very effective for either side.
There's a quote out there: "He who doesn't learn from history is bound to repeat it." Well, Munich 1938 comes to mind, and we were dealing with a crazy man then, Hitler. And I think we're dealing with a crazy man now. And I've got two questions for you. What is the reason that we're taking a no hands-on approach? And when I say no hands-on, I mean militarily, helping in any way, shape, or form. Sending them weapons and sending them bullets is one thing, but sending the Air Force to obliterate that 40-mile convoy would go a long way toward helping out big time. So what's the reason that we're not willing to do more militarily? And the second and more important question is, if Putin starts to, you said, nibble on one piece of the pie at a time, if he starts to try to reinvent the Soviet Union, one country at a time, are we going to take the same hands-off approach next time?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think the Biden administration has made a judgment. I think it's probably the right one, that the large majority of the United States, of the American people, would not support going into a shooting war with Russia, which, bombing a Russian convoy would start a shooting war with Russia, and I don't know how we would stop that from escalating, which could ultimately end up, as George mentioned, at the nuclear level before any of us know it. So the vast majority of American political leadership does not support that. That said, we are doing everything short of that by, we've provided $1 billion of military assistance in the last year, more than $5 billion in the past 8 years to Ukraine. We've mobilized an unprecedented international sanctions response that is is plunging the Russian economy into disaster, with unforeseen consequences for that completely, but as a means of doing everything we can to stop that. In terms of your second question, that's also part of the first in a way, we are substantially mobilizing and providing American military support to the NATO frontline states. That started when I was ambassador to Poland after the first Russian invasion in 2014, where we stationed about 5,000 troops in Poland, a slightly smaller number in the Baltic states. So if this ends up with a Russian occupation of Ukraine, I think we're going to look to to take that even further, to fortify the defenses of the eastern border of the alliance, particularly around something called the Suwałki Gap, which is a 60-mile border that links Lithuania and the Baltic states to the rest of Europe through Poland. If that 60-mile border gets blocked by the Russians, the Baltic states will be effectively completely surrounded by Russia and Belarus. And it would mean an attack on a NATO state. So that also has substantial potential to escalate rather quickly. So I think that will be the focus of the U.S. Response to stop Putin from going further.
Jen, I think given time, all the way in the back.
Gulf War, there was a push for ensuring the safety of nuclear reactors against military threats. Do you think the success of the pressurized water reactor in Ukraine will ensure public trust in nuclear energy to wean Europe off of Russian oil, and also emphasize the effectiveness of the International Atomic Energy Agency?
I'm not sure I understood.
So help me again, we were having a hard time hearing up here.
Sorry, the nuclear reactor that was bombed didn't explode or whatever people thought it was going to do, because of safeguards that were put into effect after the Gulf War, when they were bombing nuclear reactors in the Gulf. Now, since that did not happen, do you think that will ensure public trust in nuclear reactors so we can wean Germany off of Russian oil?
Yeah, so I think there are 2 points. One, we do not know the exact nature of what happened at that nuclear power station. And, to some degree, if you go back to Clausewitz, The Art of War, you capture the infrastructure. And Russia clearly had a desire. That plant produces 1/6 of the power for Ukraine. So Russia wants to control that critical infrastructure as a means of being able to influence and control the populace. I think that you can make a series of conclusions that Russia did not want to precipitate a core meltdown, and because wind flows west to east, they would have been the recipient of fallout as a result of a major meltdown at that plant. Having said that, nuclear power plants under the law of war are not viable targets for bombing. And so I think there are a series of issues that have been raised in terms of war crimes, whether it's the use of cluster bombs, vacuum bombs, attacking nuclear power stations, that frankly the global diplomatic community and the global national security community and the global humanitarian community are going to have to wrestle with what has happened and what are the implications for the future.
I regret that we are out of time, especially since there are so many questions still to be answered. The good news is that We at the Batten School, across UVA at the National Security Policy Center, this is a community that wants to engage with these questions, wants your help answering them. There's lots of opportunities for research and discovery as we all grapple with a very challenging situation together. I want to thank you for being here. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you for your concern, for your curiosity, for your compassion. As George said earlier, the antidote to despair is knowledge. Another antidote is action and service. Find ways that you can help. The implications on food prices and gas prices are going to be severe. You can do something to help those who are in need. Lots of ways to learn more, both here at the Batten School and also the Miller Center. UVA's Miller Center has a blog that's going to be consolidating lots of the activities across the university, including the recording for this event. With that, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great spring break.